All right, what is up, everyone? I am back with my favorite deck in all of Marvel Snap. But should you play it? Let's talk about it. All right, so this is my favorite deck in all of Marvel Snap, and it has been for quite a while now. Pretty much the entirety of that I've played Marvel Snap, I've gravitated towards this archetype, and I'm talking about Lockdown. You might know it as Location, any other variation. It's typically going to be trying to isolate lanes and make sure that your opponent does not have access to them, while having other cards to extend reach to allow you to just take over the game. So let's take a look at my typical list, and we'll go into some other cards that you might see pop up here and there and what could be viable. So you see here with my list, we have what you might see as being pretty standard, though you might have a couple of these that throw you off, for example. But the core of what we're talking about and the idea of what we're trying to, accomplish with this deck is going to be the same throughout all variations. And there are a bunch of ways you can go about building this deck. And that's what I like about it so much, is that it's very flexible. It allows you to just kind of do whatever you want based on what the meta is throwing at you. So the core cards are going to be what actually locks down the lanes. Now, Nebula, you might be saying, well, that doesn't lock down the lane. No, of course not. But Nebula is very, very key for this type of list. If you don't have Nebula, it's not going to be as good of a list. I really recommend getting her. The season pass ends tonight, so I recommend really getting her to make sure that you can make this list as viable as possible. You could go a Sunspot, but I will talk about that in a little bit. Otherwise, you have Storm, Spider-Man, and Professor X. Storm, of course, making a location into a flooding and then a flooded location, so no cards can be played there. Spider-Man ensuring that your opponent cannot play any cards at this location for the next turn. And, of course, Professor X just flat out saying, no, can't play stuff here, except for, of course, Jeff. So this is the core. It's only 4 cards. Technically 3 if you really think about it. But the rest of the deck needs to be built around this idea. So we move on to the secondary cards. This is where you're looking at your lane reach. The way that you're going to extend yourself into those lanes that you've already shut off for your opponent as well as yourself, ensuring that you will win those lanes. Now, of course, you have typical things like Jeff and Nightcrawler. If you don't have Jeff, Nightcrawler is okay as well as a replacement there, something that's flexible to move into other spots like the flooded location. But the reason Jeff is so good in this deck is because it allows you to play into your Professor X lane. You can move him into that lane or directly play him right on top of him. That flexibility is very, very good. And in those instances where you get things like Sanctum Sanctorum or lanes that you can't play into typically, Jeff also just gives you that extended reach as well. Otherwise, you're looking at things like Doctor Doom, very typical turn 6 play to just, throw out some Doom bots into your flooded location. I really like Captain Marvel as well as being a play that you can do, which we'll talk about that setup in a little bit. And then, of course, Claw is another example of a card that you can use to just go ahead and add some extra power into your flooded lane, your Professor X lane, anything like that. If you don't want to go with something like Captain Marvel, you have the flexibility to really make this deck your own. And as long as you have the ability to extend into your other lanes, like this category implies, then you're pretty much good to go. Continuing with secondary cards is we also want lane power. Typically, when you make your lane shut down and you lock down one lane, you might be able to guarantee that lane's being won. You don't always need to go with the Doctor Doom play. Oftentimes, that Doctor Doom play is actually a detriment to your own success. Maybe you didn't get your Professor X set up like you wanted to, or you don't have Spider-Man, so you just need to output a huge amount of power on the last turn to help guarantee that that lane is won. Cards like Gamora. Orca is what you might see in the list that I just showed you earlier. It's surprisingly pretty nice. When it's alone in the lane, it's 16 power, which is definitely nothing to scoff at. And if you're playing it alongside other cards in that lane, that's okay. You're still getting 11 power, which is just one short of Hulk or Magneto, as you see here. And the reason I don't play Magneto typically in this is because I don't like pulling my opponent's 3 and 4 costs into this lane, because 12 power sometimes can just be awkward when you're just piling a bunch of stuff into that lane in general. The juice isn't worth the squeeze, in my opinion, and the 1 less power for Orca typically doesn't make too much of a difference most times. And then I threw in Giganto here as just another example. I don't really recommend playing Giganto in this kind of list, though you can absolutely make it work. The only problem with Giganto is then you can only play him in the left lane, so that kind of makes it so your Storm location, your Professor X, things like that really need to be in the middle and right lane. And having the flexibility of where you want to lock down the location based on lane variance and what's going on is the whole thing of the deck, right? I also include Green Goblin in this, Hobgoblin. That does count as lane power because you're giving them negative power, so that can also be something to consider as well. And then you're looking at flex spots. Flex spots like Polaris, Scorpion, Iceman, Daredevil, and of course Luke Cage. All of these are meta dependent, what you're seeing a lot on ladder, and what you typically want to counter in the long run. And the cool thing about your flex spots is that pretty much all the cards here are going to be pretty powerful. Scorpion's great, Iceman's great as disruption, Daredevil is amazing as far as information goes. If you're playing Daredevil, I'd kind of want to go with playing Gamora in addition to Professor X, so you have another option in the 5-drop to really get the power out of Daredevil. Of course, Polaris is nice against things like Galactus to pull their 1 or 2 drop early on into a lane they didn't want to play, especially if you're already locking down a lane that they could have played Galactus on with things like Storm or Spider-Man. That can really mess up their flow. And then Luke Cage is really nice as a tech piece if you're seeing a lot of high evolutionary, or at least the variant that is going to be trying to hit you with Cyclops and things like that. Now, these are trap cards. And what I mean by trap cards is one that seem good on paper, but through my experience and my play, and I have an extensive amount of play on this deck. For example, this season, I've gone all the way from 40 to, I'm in the mid 90s right now, around 95. I'm going to try and make a push for Infinite tonight. If I don't hit it, whatever, but it's been entirely encompassed from playing this type of deck. And I've tried both version I'm showing you now and the High Evo deck as well. And unless you're playing the High Evo version, don't play Sunspot. You do not float enough mana in this version that I'm showing you here where Sunspot is worth it. So I don't recommend doing it. Unfortunately, it's a little awkward. Juggernaut seems like it'd be good, a nice pairing with things like Storm and other stuff like that, but more times than not, you actually don't want to throw things your opponent has into other lanes for the most part. The only times I could say that Juggernaut is very good is if you're going against a discard or an High Evo deck, where I would say that you are actually unfavored in those matchups for the most part, unless you're using tech cards like Juggernaut or Luke Cage. That is entirely meta dependent. But more times than not, Juggernaut's just a little awkward and kind of disrupts your own flow. Another one is Leader. You might think Leader on the last turn to, grab one of their best cards on your side. It's just clunky. It doesn't always line up like you want it to. And then lastly, Vision. Vision seems nice. It does kind of the same thing as Captain Marvel, but Captain Marvel moving on her own, where Vision needs to be moved by you, makes him a worse turn 6 play, where Captain Marvel can actually be a very nice turn 6 play, which we'll get to now. So these are key plays, and I have a little bit of a scenario painted for you for a typical game that you might want to see how you line up your plays. Don't worry about what the locations are. The Atlantis and the Eternity Range are just random ones I put. So let's say you start on turn 1, you go Nebula on turn 1. Turn 2, you play Jeff. Doesn't matter where you play Jeff. It could be mid, it could be, left, right, it doesn't matter. And then you go Storm over your Nebula. You want to get that going. And rather than playing something into the Storm lane or into the flooded lane, you actually are going to play Spider-Man into a separate lane altogether. While your opponent is trying to put power onto the flooded lane, you're going to block off another lane for your Professor X on turn 5. And then on turn 6, you play Captain Marvel. And now that you have Jeff on the board, Jeff gives you the flexibility of okay, do I want to move my Jeff to the flooded location, give extra power there, or do I want to pull it into the Professor X lane just in case they played something, in that lane when you Spider-Man'd or already had something there and you need that little extra reach. And then typically your Captain Marvel will swoop in to the flooded location and then you win. Now, Will every game work like this? Of course not. But the deck is very flexible in what you're going to do and allows you to have that, like I said, flexibility to make plays like this or determine where you want to go from each card. Spider-Man is a very interesting card for this deck because you could do like I did here and then Spider-Man on 4, Professor X on 5. But let's say you don't have Professor X this game and I'm trying to actually just output a lot of power with things like Orca and Gamora. Then you can Spider-Man on 5 instead to lock down a lane and then focus your lane power on a separate lane while your opponent is trying to, race you in that regard. So the flexibility is phenomenal and you really want to be smart with your Spider-Mans on either 4 or 5, followed by Professor X, but don't sleep on Captain Marvel in this list. Her swooping in and moving into that photo location is very good and can really help you against things like Killmonger moving forward. So let's talk about the unfavored matchups. These are decks that are gonna probably beat you more often than not unless you're specifically teching in cards for these matchups. But I would argue by doing so, you're making matchups against the rest of the field kind of worse. So first thing first is going to be discard. Things like Dracula, the Collector, and Morbius get bigger over time. And Dracula is a phenomenal turn 4 play into your flooded location if you stormed on turn 3. And a lot of times, if you're playing against a good discard player, they'll be able to manipulate their hand in a way where Dracula is going to be guaranteed to be 12, 16, even 20 power, which usually you're not going to be able to output that kind of power in that flooded location anyway, and that can make for some awkward games as well. And then the Collector is going to be a card that just isn't even ongoing. So if you wanted to tech in things like Enchantress, well, it's not going to help you there. It might help you against Morbius, but overall, this matchup's a little rough. They curve out very efficiently, and it does counter your game plan pretty effectively. The next one is going to be High Evolutionary. Again, if you're teching in Luke Cage, then this matchup is not as bad. But if you're not, then you have to worry about things like Wasp and Cyclops on your float location, Sunspot and float location as well. And then of course this deck is going to spend a lot of times floating mana to make sure their Cyclops goes off and hits your cards, their Sunspot continues to grow, and while you're trying to contest other lanes and you probably lose out on the flooded lane in general, they have a big Hulk coming down that is oftentimes 18-20 power pretty easily. This deck is very, very rough in the matchup for this lockdown deck. Unless you're playing the mirror match and you're doing the High Evo version yourself, which is albeit a little bit of a different deck in general. Oftentimes they might not even run Professor X. It's really rough. And if you tech in Luke Cage, I think you can have some success farming High Evo in that sense, especially if you play Luke Cage on turn 6. But that does make your curve a little bit awkward. It can actually present some drawbacks for the deck in general. Otherwise, especially in other matchups where Luke Cage ends up being a dead card, raise problems there as well. Lastly is going to be Patriot, I think, is another one that's a rough matchup, especially with things like Doctor Doom that they're running, Ultron, Debris. They have quite a bit of reach, just like you do, to get into those photo locations even after you shut them down. And then the power output that Patriot allows them to have. And of course, they have things like Blue Marvel as well to increase more power. Sometimes they're running Khazar to make those rocks from Debris bigger, or Ultron, his little robots. That deck is also a problem and a rough one in general. Not saying that any of these decks, by the way, are unbeatable. Of course, you can win these matchups by being an efficient pilot and getting more familiar with the deck and of being smart with your location variants and the manipulation that you're going to have on these locations. But overall, these decks are going to present some telltale signs where you might want to retreat earlier rather than later. But let's talk about the favored matchups. Part of the reason you want to be playing this deck. First and foremost, you have Lockjaw, specifically the Jane Foster Thor variant. Now, the High Evo variant is also, I would say, a slightly favored matchup, but they're more in the 50-50 ballpark with the other decks that aren't listed in either the favored or unfavored list here. But the reason that this deck is going to be a bit favored in your matchup is because they try to put their eggs all in one basket, so to speak, and you can be very efficient in locking down their Lockjaw lane early. In the RNG aspect of the deck, in terms of trying to pull out big cards, is going to be in your favor because you have a lot more control over what your deck's trying to do, where they're leaving it up to the RNG gods. As well as, Their early game is very poor. They usually don't play anything until turn 3, being a Lockjaw into a Wasp or whatever, or even like a Thor, and those are games you're going to often win pretty easily. The other one is Galactus. I really think Galactus is not a bad matchup at all, and I would argue that I win against Galactus more often than not because of your lane manipulation. And if you're playing a tech card that I personally run, like Polaris, it gives you that little extra wiggle room of moving a card of their early game into a lane where they can't play Galactus anymore. Of course, there's nothing better than them playing on turn 3 their wave, and then you know where they're going to Galactus, you call the shot out, and you just play Professor X. And of course, if you're playing Jeff, that gives you extra reach as well to get into those lanes. If they Spider-Man against you, you also are running Spider-Man to shut off their lane, so if they can't play anything on turn 6 either. So if you end up in a scenario where you both Spider-Man on turn 5, you have the Jeff. Most Galactus lists don't run Jeff. I would personally run Jeff if you're playing Galactus, but that's just me. But a lot of them don't. A lot of times you're coming out on top there. Your lane manipulation is very good against this deck and is a good matchup. And the other thing is Kitty Pryde decks. And this can be both Sarah control decks as well as bounce decks, especially the bounce decks, by the way. Yes, elephant in the room. Sarah control does have Killmonger in the deck. And when you see the telltale signs that show you this is a Sarah version of the deck with things like Sentinel, then you're going to be able to know, hey, I need to hold back on playing Nebula or not put all of my focus on getting Nebula big to try and win this lane. You're going to have to be a bit more flexible. But when you see that it's a Sarah control deck and they could have a Killmonger, you can easily put your game plan around what you want to do and make sure that they aren't going to be able to beat you in those lanes. Otherwise, the bounce version of the deck is also a really rough matchup because again, your lane manipulation, bounce decks really want to, on turns 4 and 5 especially, take all of their cards, pick them up, put them back into their hand, and if you're locking down a lane with Professor X, if you're saying they can't play a card over this lane with Spider-Man, and by the way, if you're playing against the bounce deck, I recommend if you see them have a lane with 2 cards in it and one with 1 card in it, Spider-Man, the one that has the more open slots. Force them to only play a couple of cards. Even if you feel like you're losing the other lane, it's worth it because you have the lane manipulation to extend the power in the late game where now you're shutting off their explosiveness and flexibility of their own bounce deck. Again, it's a favorite matchup and one that I think you're going to win more often than not. Now, looking forward, how does the deck evolve as we get more cards? This is a deck that is poised and in a great spot to get more and more cards to support it and evolve the archetype into other avenues. We have Spider-Ham coming out this month. It's going to be another great disruption card. Let's say you're going against a mirror match or one of the ones that I said were a rough matchup. Things like Patriot that have the reach in Ultron or Doctor Doom themselves. Well, that Doctor Doom, that Ultron is just a 6/8 or a vanilla 6/5 now. Echo is another one that makes sure that you can turn off ongoing things, again, like Patriot, or at least designated to a specific lane where it allows you to lock down the other lanes and kind of pigeonhole them to not having a lot of options in what they're going to be playing. Jean Grey would represent a deck that's going to be a little bit different. I'd probably want to play Kitty Pryde in the 1-drop rather than Nebula. That way you can have the flexibility of playing Kitty Pryde on Jean Grey and then trying to be flexible with the other lanes in general. This one's a little bit of a reach, I'll admit, on my part, but I think it's an interesting card enough that can shut down cards. By the way, Jean Grey is basically a Morag on a body. It says if players are able to, they have to play their first card where she is every turn. Strife is a very interesting one that, again, these are all subject to change, but he's a 3/7 that says if your opponent has 12 or more power in this location at any point in the game, he destroys himself. Well, you don't have to worry about that if you're playing him on a locked location behind Storm and flooding it, or if you play a Professor X over on top of him, kind of like you would with like an Attuma. By the way, Attuma is a very cool card that you could very well easily play in this kind of deck as well. And then lastly is Miss Marvel, which is just a super Mr. Fantastic. It's a 3/4 that says if it's the only card in this location, then the adjacent locations get +5 power. This again adds insane levels of reach to the deck, and that seems incredibly powerful, and I'm very interested to see how the deck can work her in. I would say pretty easily moving forward when we eventually get her. So now it comes down to the question of, should you play this deck? If you like this style, if you like shutting down the lanes, if you like having the flexibility of what the deck can do, I would argue that this deck does have a high learning curve on it. It's not as simple and straightforward as other decks can be, but I think that's what is attractive about the deck, and having the flexibility and controlling the lanes, controlling what your opponent's trying to do, and making sure that you come out on top, and also knowing when to retreat as well. There are plenty of times where your opponent makes their plays very nicely, or you're going against an unfavored matchup, and don't stay in for that Dr. Doom that's only going to maybe win you the game, and you're hoping that they just don't play in one lane or the other. They don't have this X card. It's not worth it. But the games you do win, you win pretty handedly. So if you want to play this deck and you like this kind of style, you absolutely should play it. And again, I have climbed this entire season, even with the meta filled with all these unfavored matchups that we talked about, because in the unfavored matchup category, a lot of those decks are everywhere, especially high Evo. And if I can still climb from 40 to 95 over the course of this season, entirely only playing this deck, when the meta was also highly unfavored against me for the majority of it, I think it's a damn good deck, and I think you guys would have a lot of fun playing it. So let me know what you guys think. Do you like this deck? Do you like the type of video that this is, breaking down how this deck works, how I play it, and what the best plays are, cards, etc., etc. If you play this deck as well, if you played a variation of it, let me know down below what you play differently. Do you agree with the trap cards? Do you think that some of those are a bit more playable? How's your matchups going? Do you think the favored and the unfavored line up with your experience of the deck? Everyone has a tailored experience to them and a different experience overall in the meta. So let's see if ours lines up with each other. But again, thank you guys so much for watching. Thank you guys so much for your support, and I will see you on the next one.